The black belt instructor, Derek Mitchell, provocatively challenged a black janitor, James Washington, to spar for fun, loudly asking if he had ever seen a real fight in his life, his belt gleaming under the gym lights. James, who was 42 and had worked as a janitor for only 3 weeks, usually after hours, calmly told Derek he didn't want to bother him and continued cleaning a stubborn stain. Derek laughed theatrically, drawing the attention of his 8 students, who nervously laughed, some clearly uncomfortable. Unknown to Derek, James had spent the past 2 decades trying to completely erase his past, having left the fighting ring after a life-altering accident and keeping this secret even from his teenage daughter. Derek continued to mock James, approaching him with an arrogant smile, insisting on a little demonstration to show the difference between someone who trains and someone who just cleans, betting James didn't even know a basic guard. James felt a familiar sensation, like a dormant muscle awakening, and his brief eye contact with Derek made the instructor involuntarily step back. Derek, trying to hide his sudden uncertainty, insisted it was just an educational demonstration, nothing too serious, to teach beginners respect for martial arts. James put down his bucket and slowly stood up, his movements surprisingly fluid for someone supposedly unfamiliar with a tatami mat. Students around the gym stopped their training, sensing an unfolding event. James finally spoke, his voice calm like a lake before a storm, agreeing to the spar but stipulating that Derek would apologize to everyone for turning the mat into a circus afterward. Derek laughed, though the sound was forced this time, retorting that James would be the one apologizing to the floor. None of those present knew that James Washington was once James Silent Storm Washington, a 5-time world mixed martial arts champion who retired at the peak of his career following an accident that claimed the life of his best friend and training partner. Since then, James had sworn never to fight again, but felt some promises must be broken when dignity is at stake. Derek dramatically adjusted his black belt, relishing the attention, and instructed everyone to gather for a practical demonstration of hierarchy in martial arts. James watched as the 8 students formed a semicircle. Some appeared eager, while others were visibly uncomfortable. A young Asian woman with tied-back hair quietly expressed disapproval to her classmate. Derek continued dramatically, stating that James was a perfect example of someone who didn't understand that elite gyms are not for well, you know. James felt the familiar twinge in his chest, the same he'd felt 20 years prior from similar comments about fighters who didn't fit the champion mold, but now at 42, he had learned to convert anger into a much more powerful fuel. Sensei Derek, the young Asian woman timidly interrupted, suggesting they continue normal training as it was getting late. Derek sharply cut her off, questioning her teaching methodology. Derek told Sarah to sit down and watch, claiming she would learn more in the next 5 minutes than in a month of conventional training. James noticed Derek using the girl's full name, a clear assertion of authority, and recognized the fear in her eyes. This look was the same he had seen in the mirror 2 decades ago when he woke in a panic, recalling the accident that killed Tony Hammer Rodriguez, his best friend and training partner. Tony had died because of James, from a series of punches James had thrown with excessive force during sparring, causing Tony to fall, hit his head strangely, and never wake up. The investigation concluded it was an accident, but James knew the truth. He had lost control due to pressure and racist comments from the audience that night. So, the janitor, Derek sneered, how about showing my students a basic guard? Or is that too complicated for someone who only pushes a mop? Laughter echoed, but James remained motionless, briefly closing his eyes, transported back to that Las Vegas ring, hearing the same comments that preceded the tragedy. Derek persisted, circling James like a predator, asking if he was scared or just going to stand there like a lamppost, as he did with the squeegee all day. This was Derek's first fatal mistake. He pushed James lightly on the shoulder, a seemingly harmless touch, yet full of the arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences. James absorbed the push without moving an inch, his feet planted like oak roots, and Derek felt as if he had tried to push a concrete wall. The instructor's arrogant smile faltered for a split second. Interesting, James muttered, more to himself than to Derek. It's been a while since someone tried to provoke me like that. There was something in James's voice that changed the atmosphere. It wasn't a threat or anger, but the frightening calm of someone who had survived much darker valleys transformed. Derek, unable to interpret the danger, doubled down. "Did you hear that, guys?" Derek said. "He thinks it's interesting. How about we show him the difference between thinking and knowing?" What Derek failed to realize was that every humiliating word and gesture was reawakening something dormant in James for 2 decades, not anger or a desire for revenge, but a far more dangerous clarity, the crystal-clear memory of who he truly was when he stopped hiding. Sarah Chun watched the scene with increasing discomfort. There was something in the janitor's breathing, the almost imperceptible tensing of his muscles, that reminded her of documentaries about large predators on the Discovery Channel, the calm before the attack. "Last chance, buddy," Derek announced, now clearly irritated by James's lack of response. "Either you accept the demonstration like a man, or I call security to escort you out. And guess what? You lose your job too." James opened his eyes slowly, and when his gaze met Derek's, the instructor felt a chill run down his spine, as if he had just awakened a dragon he had mistaken for a harmless lizard. "All right," James said finally, his voice low but laden with an authority that instantly silenced everyone present. "But when we're done, I want you to explain to your students why you turned a place of learning into a circus of humiliation." Derek laughed, but this time the sound was nervous. "Explain. Man, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do when you're on the floor." Neither of them knew that James had spent the last 20 years not just running from his past, but perfecting an emotional control that had transformed his former destructive rage into something much more refined and devastatingly effective. Each new humiliation only fueled a silent strength within him, a cold determination that his former opponents knew well, but that Derek was about to discover in the worst possible way. Derek adjusted his posture, clearly pleased with the respectful silence that had fallen over the gym. His 8 students formed a perfect circle around the mat, some eager for the demonstration, others visibly uncomfortable with the situation unfolding before them. "Everyone, you are about to witness a lesson worth more than 6 months of training," Derek announced theatrically, extending his arms like a showman, highlighting the difference between those who dedicate their lives to martial arts and those who just clean the floor where real fighters walk. James stood motionless in the center of the mat, but something had shifted in his breathing. His eyes closed briefly, and for a moment he was no longer in that gym in Denver. He was back at the National Gymnasium in Las Vegas 22 years ago, hearing identical comments from the audience before his world title fight against Victor, the Demolition Man, Petrov. "Look at that little black guy," someone in the stands had shouted that night. "I bet he won't last 3 rounds against a real fighter." James had won by technical knockout in the 2nd round, but the victory had cost him dearly. The pressure of the racist comments had caused him to lose control during the subsequent sparring session, resulting in the accidental death of Tony Rodriguez. "So, Janitor," Derek sneered, now circling James like a predator, "how about showing my students how not to do a basic guard? Or is that too complicated for someone who only knows how to push him up?" That's when Sarah Chun could no longer remain silent. The 22-year-old purple belt in jiu-jitsu and master's student in sports psychology had spent the last 2 years documenting cases of discrimination in sports for her thesis. What she was witnessing was valuable academic material, but also deeply disturbing. "Sensei Derek," she interrupted firmly, "can I ask you a question? Why exactly do you think it's necessary to humiliate someone who is just doing his job?" The silence that followed was deafening. Derek slowly turned to Sarah, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of surprise and irritation. "Excuse me, Sarah, but who's teaching the class here?" "You are," she replied calmly, "but that shouldn't include racial humiliation disguised as a technical demonstration." Several students exchanged nervous glances. No one had ever confronted Derek like this before. The instructor felt his face flush with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "Racial," Derek laughed forcibly, "this has nothing to do with race. It has to do with respect for the martial art and knowing your place," Derek declared. James opened his eyes slowly, finding something in Sarah's speech, in the courage of a young woman standing up to established authority, that reminded him of his younger sister, Kesha. Kesha had possessed that same determination, that same refusal to silently accept injustice. Kesha had died at 17, a victim of a stray bullet during a police confrontation in her neighborhood, while James was competing in Japan when he received the news. This was another person he loved lost while he pursued glory in distant rings, another reason to abandon everything and vanish into the simplicity of an anonymous life. "Sarah," Derek said in a dangerously low voice, "if you can't respect my teaching methods, maybe you should look for another gym. There are places more suited to people with your mentality." The threat hung in the air like toxic smoke. Sarah felt a chill but held her ground. "My tuition is paid, Sensei, and I believe that everyone here deserves a learning environment based on mutual respect, not humiliation." That's when James did something unexpected. He began to smile. It wasn't a nervous or submissive smile, but the slow, calculated smile of someone who had just found a reason to stop hiding. For 20 years, he had carried the weight of guilt for 2 deaths indirectly resulting from his involvement in the fighting world. Now, seeing a brave young woman defending principles of justice he had abandoned decades ago, James Washington began to remember who he really was. "Derek," James said finally, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made everyone in the room turn to him, "the young lady is right. This isn't about martial arts. It's about you trying to feel important by belittling others." Derek spun on his heels, his face red with indignation. "How dare you lecture me about martial arts? You don't even know what a dojo is." James took a step forward, and something fundamental changed in his posture. His shoulders straightened, his center of gravity lowered imperceptibly, and his feet positioned themselves in a stance any experienced fighter would instantly recognize as perfect. "Actually," James said calmly, "I know exactly what a dojo is, and I know that this place stopped being one a long time ago." Derek felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. There was something about the way James moved now, the way he occupied the space, that awakened all of his instincts for self-preservation, yet his wounded pride would not let him back down. "Enough talk," Derek growled, assuming his favorite fighting stance. "I'll teach you respect the hard way." Sarah watched with growing apprehension, but also professional fascination. She had documented hundreds of hours of sparring and competitions for her research, and something about the janitor's movements, the economy of movement, the controlled breathing, the calm presence radiating contained power, reminded her of the great masters she had studied in historical videos. James closed his eyes briefly and allowed 22 years of muscle memory to resurface, every perfected technique, every victory won, every lesson learned in the world's most brutal rings. When he opened them again, Derek was looking directly into the eyes of Silent Storm Washington, 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. "Last chance to apologize," James offered kindly, to her, "to your students, and to turn this place back into a learning space." Derek laughed, but the sound was nervous and forced. "Apologize, man. You'll be begging for forgiveness when you're on the floor." What Derek couldn't see was that James had already identified all of his technical weaknesses, the high guard that exposed his body, the tendency to retreat with his right leg first, the way he telegraphed his punches with micro-movements of his shoulder. 22 years away from the ring had not erased decades of refined technical analysis. Sarah noticed other students instinctively backing away, like wild animals sensing an impending storm. Something in the room's energy had completely changed, as if the air had become electrically charged before a lightning strike. It was when everyone laughed at Derek's latest taunts that something unexpected began to form in James's expression. It was not anger or a desire for revenge, but the calm determination of someone who had found a cause worthy of breaking a 20-year vow of silence. Some of those present began to realize that something extraordinary was about to happen, even without fully grasping what they were witnessing. Derek assumed his favorite fighting stance, the one he had used to intimidate hundreds of beginners over the years, feet shoulder-width apart, fists clenched at chest level, weight slightly forward, the classic stance of someone who had learned martial arts in controlled environments against predictable opponents. James stood motionless for a few seconds, simply observing. His eyes scanned Derek from head to toe, automatically cataloging every technical detail. The high guard that left his ribs exposed, the unstable base that compromised his balance, the excessive tension in his shoulders that telegraphed every move before it even began. Still waiting, Derek sneered, hopping slightly on his feet. Or are you just going to stand there like a lamp post? That's when James did something no one expected. He started to move. It wasn't a dramatic change, just a subtle repositioning of his feet, a slight lowering of his center of gravity, his shoulders relaxing into a perfectly horizontal line. But to anyone who knew what to look for, the transformation was instantaneous and frightening. Sarah Chun felt a chill run down her spine. During 2 years studying sports biomechanics, she had analyzed hundreds of hours of footage of great fighters. What she had just witnessed was the transition from an ordinary man to a born predator, a change as subtle as it was devastating. Interesting, Derek muttered, his confidence wavering for the first time. There was something about the way James now occupied the space that awakened all of his self-preservation instincts. James took a step forward, and Derek instinctively backed away. The movement was so involuntary, so primitive, that several students noticed. A black belt backing away from a janitor. The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. Problem? James asked softly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced everyone. Derek felt the blood rush to his cheeks. His reputation was being questioned in front of his own students, and he couldn't back down now, even though every fiber of his being screamed at him to stop and apologize. No problem, Derek replied, forcing a smile. Just admiring your posture. Did someone teach you that on YouTube? The joke fell flat. No one laughed, and the tension in the room had become almost palpable. Actually, James said calmly, I learned it at a place called the Las Vegas National Gym. Maybe you've heard of it. Derek frowned. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place the reference. Las Vegas. What kind of weekend boot camp did you do there? Sarah Chun discreetly pulled her phone out and quickly typed, Las Vegas National Gym Martial Arts. What she found made her blood run cold. This wasn't just any prep course, it was where the world's greatest MMA champions of the last 3 decades had trained. Derek, James continued, his voice still calm, last chance. Apologize to Sarah for questioning her right to speak. Apologize to your students for turning this place into a circus. And most of all, apologize to yourself for becoming exactly the kind of person that martial arts should teach you not to be. The offer of clemency hung in the air like smoke. Derek could have chosen humility, acknowledged he had crossed the line, preserved what little dignity he had left. Instead, he attacked. Derek's first punch was technically perfect. A fast, accurate jab executed exactly as he had learned in the manuals, the kind of punch that worked against 99% of the people he had sparred with over the years. James wasn't in the 99%. The movement was so fast, so fluid, that half of those present couldn't even process what had happened. James simply wasn't where Derek's fist had been aimed. His body had slid to the side like water flowing around a rock, and suddenly Derek was off balance, his arm extended into thin air. Nice try, James commented softly, already repositioned and perfectly balanced, clean technique, adequate speed, but you telegraphed the move with your right shoulder. Derek spun wildly, trying to locate his opponent, wondering how someone had moved so fast. Beginner's luck, he muttered, more to himself than to James. The second attack came in quick succession. Jab, straight, hook, 3 punches linked with the precision of someone who had practiced the combination thousands of times, his favorite sequence used to finish sparring sessions and impress beginners. Again, James simply wasn't there. This time, Sarah managed to follow the movement. James had lowered himself slightly, allowing the jab to pass over his head by inches. The straight punch found only air when he leaned back in an impossible curve, and when Derek threw the hook with all his strength, James took a small step back, causing the fist to pass millimeters from his chin. Interesting combination, James observed, still breathing evenly, works well against people who stand still, but you're leaving your left side completely exposed. After the hook, Derek was starting to sweat. This wasn't normal. He had landed thousands of punches in his life, and now he couldn't land a single one on a man who had supposedly never fought before. Stop dancing and fight, Derek shouted, launching an even more aggressive sequence. That's when James decided the demonstration had gone on long enough. Derek's third attack, a desperate combination of punches and kicks, again found only air. But this time, something different happened. When Derek recovered after missing all his blows, James was inexplicably closer. "How?" Derek whispered, realizing he had completely lost control of the distance. "Derek," James said softly, now an arm's length away, "do you want to know the difference between someone who learned to fight in gyms and someone who learned in professional rings?" Before Derek could answer, James did something that defied everything those present thought they knew about physics. Without appearing to use any force, without any sudden or aggressive movements, he simply touched Derek on the chest with the palm of his right hand. Derek flew. He wasn't pushed or knocked down. He was literally propelled backward as if struck by an invisible wave. His feet left the ground. He traveled nearly 2 meters through the air and landed on his back with an impact that made everyone in the room gasp. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek lay on the floor for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened. There was no pain, just the irresistible force of someone operating on a level completely different from anything he had ever known. "That," Derek muttered, trying to get up, "that's impossible." Sarah Chun had stopped breathing. In 2 years of studying martial arts, she had never witnessed such a controlled and devastating display of power. There was no brutality, no anger, just the clinical application of a technique she had only seen in legends. "Actually," James said calmly, reaching out to help Derek to his feet, "it's quite simple once you understand leverage, timing, and energy transfer. Principles I've learned over a 22-year professional career." Derek ignored the outstretched hand and stood up on his own, his legs still shaking. 22 years professional career in what?" Sarah answered, her voice almost a whisper. "You don't understand who he is, do you?" Everyone turned to her, who was still holding her cell phone with the results of her search. On the screen, dozens of articles, photos, and videos confirmed what her instincts had already realized. James Washington, she read aloud, also known as Silent Storm. 5-time world mixed martial arts champion, considered one of the best technical fighters in history, retired undefeated after a 22-year career, following an accident that resulted in the death of his training partner. The impact of these words hit the room like a bomb. Derek felt his face go pale as reality set in. He had challenged a living martial arts legend. He had publicly humiliated someone who could have knocked him out with a casual move. 5-time world champion, Derek stammered, all his arrogance evaporating instantly. James nodded silently. "I retired at 29. Since then, I've been working whatever jobs I can find. Cleaning, maintenance, simple jobs, simple life, no spotlight, no cameras, no need to prove anything to anyone." The transformation in Derek was instantaneous and painful to watch. The arrogant man was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the magnitude of his ignorance. I didn't know," Derek whispered. "If I had known..." "If you had known, would you have treated me with respect?" James interrupted gently. "But would you still have humiliated some other janitor, another worker who had no credentials to defend himself?" The question cut deeper than any physical blow. Derek realized that James had pinpointed the root of his real problem, not ignorance about his credentials, but the fundamental arrogance that made him believe he could humiliate people based on their professions. Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm, stating that for 2 years she had trained at that academy out of respect for Derek's experience, but what she witnessed today was not teaching, it was bullying disguised as instruction. Other students began to murmur in agreement. The revelation about James had completely shifted everyone's perspective on what they had seen. "James," Derek said finally, his voice imbued with a humility no one there had ever heard before, "I sincerely apologize to you, to Sarah, to everyone here. I have no excuse for my behavior." James nodded, accepting the apology with the same grace with which he had mastered the physical confrontation. "Appreciate it, Derek, but apologies are only the first step. The question is, what are you going to do differently from now on?" Derek looked around the room, seeing his students with new eyes. Some seemed disappointed in his behavior, others clearly reevaluating everything they thought they knew about respect and hierarchy. "I'll change," Derek promised. "It'll take time, but I'll change." That's when Sarah asked a question that surprised everyone. "Mr. Washington, would you consider teaching again?" because I think we could all learn a lot more from someone who understands that true strength comes with responsibility." James smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him that night. "Maybe," he said, "but not to teach fighting techniques. To teach something much more important, that respect isn't earned with belts or titles, but with character." As Derek fully absorbed the most humiliating lesson of his life, one question remained in the air. Would one night of humility be enough to transform decades of arrogance, or would an even deeper change be necessary for true justice to be served? 3 months later, the gym had been completely transformed. James Washington was no longer just the janitor. Sarah Chun had convinced the gym owner to hire him as an instructor specializing in advanced techniques and martial arts philosophy. Derek Mitchell lost half of his students in the first week after the incident. The video Sarah had discreetly recorded spread across social media, showing a black belt being humiliated by a mere janitor, ruining his reputation in the martial arts community. "Sensei James," Sarah said after a class on respect and humility, "thank you for teaching me that true strength doesn't need to be displayed to be recognized." James smiled, organizing the equipment, saying his best lesson was simple: never judge someone by their profession or appearance. Everyone carries stories that can surprise us. Derek continued teaching at a smaller gym, but now with a humility forced by public shame. He had learned the hard way that arrogance comes at a price. Sometimes justice comes quietly, like a storm that transforms everything without making a sound. James proved that true revenge is not destroying your opponent, but showing that greatness comes from character, not titles.